Good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's Last Post ceremony. My name is Caris May, and joining us today from the Australian Army is Lieutenant Colonel Tony Bushby. We warmly welcome the families and friends of those who've lost their lives, whose lives have been affected by the Banker Island massacre. We are honoured tonight to acknowledge Mrs Patricia Adam, Chair of the Committee of Defence and Armed Forces of the French House of Representatives, accompanied by His Excellency Mr Christophe Lecourtier, Ambassador to Australia from France. We also welcome Air Vice Marshal Tracy Smart, Surgeon General, Australian Defence Force and Commander Joint Health, Wing Commander Anne O'Leary on behalf of the Australian Defence Force nurses, Wing Commander Sharon Bone, member of the Australian War Memorial Council and former Air Force nurse, Miss Rhonda Davies, representing her husband, Air Vice Marshal Gavin Davies, Chief of Air Force, and Flight Lieutenant Lisa Stanwyck, representing her husband, Warrant Officer Robert Stanwyck, Warrant Officer of the Air Force. We also welcome Mr Peter Everly, President of the ACT Branch, Returned and Services League of Australia, Mrs Colleen Thurgar, former President, ACT Branch of the Australian Services League of Australia and Vietnam Army Nurse, Mrs Colleen Caneen, Australian College of Nursing, and the Defence graduates who are commencing their employment this year. We wish you every success. Tonight we welcome all the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that support them. We acknowledge the members of RSL and Services Clubs Association, RSL Victoria and RSL Queensland, who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony from around Australia. During this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the pool of reflection by visitors. To commence this evening's ceremony, I invite you all to stand and join in singing the National Anthem. I would like to now invite Dr Brendan Nelson, Director of the Australian War Memorial, to the lectern.
Thank you, Caris. Every day here is important. There is none more important than this one. Behind me, you can see 5 stained glass windows above the entrance to the Hall of Memory, within which is interred the unknown Australian soldier. You can't see the images from where you're standing. The one in the centre, which was chosen amongst the 15 to be the most important in revealing what we regard as important as Australians, is that of a nurse. She looks directly down Anzac Parade, and the quality chosen for her of the 15 informing character which transcends everything else in life is devotion. To completely subsume yourself in the cause and the people to which you have committed. And along Anzac Parade, where she looks, on her left is a memorial to the nurses, and it simply says, "Beyond all praise." Today we pause here in the presence of the contemporary military nursing leadership, those who have served as nurses, descendants and relatives of those who've served, to remember the massacre of 22 young Australian Army nurses on Raji Beach, Banker Island, 75 years ago today, survived by only one of them. These nurses were among 70,000 Australian women who would mobilise to the defence of Australia and all we hold dear in the Second World War. The sweeping advance of militarist Imperial Japan on Singapore was swift, crushing the courageous but inadequate British and Allied defence of the island. Although they protested, leaving their patients, 65 Australian Army nurses were embarked on SS Brook on the 12th of February 1942. 2 days later, the desperately overloaded ship was attacked and bombed by Japanese planes, sinking within half an hour of Sumatra. 12 nurses were killed or drowned in the water. Desperately clinging to debris and determined to support one another, especially the injured, 22 of those nurses would spend from 8 to 65 hours in the water before stepping onto the sand of Raji Beach, Banker Island. Some were badly injured. All wore their uniforms and their Red Cross armbands. The Japanese found them on this day, the 16th of February. The only survivor of what would follow was Vivian Bullwinkle, a giant of the Australian nursing profession, who described what happened after the war. She said, about 10 o'clock on the 16th of February, the ship's officer returned with a party of about 20 Japanese soldiers. They lined us up, the men, of whom there were about 50 on one side, and the 22 nurses and one civilian woman on the other. They then took the men away down the beach behind a bluff. They came back and cleaned their rifles in front of us and then signed us to march into the sea. They then started machine gunning from behind. The bullet that hit me struck at the waistline and just went straight through. The waves washed me back into the sand. All was quiet. The Japanese had disappeared. Prior to their execution, tending the wounded on the beach, the nurses contemplated escape. Matron Irene Drummond spoke softly. She reminded everyone that they could not abandon their remaining patients, saying, "Where there is life, there is hope." When the Japanese set up the machine guns facing the water, their fate was clear. No order was given. The nurses just started shuffling forward into the sea. There was no shouting, no hysteria or panic. Sister Florence Casson, who'd been severely wounded in the bombing, her leg broken, unable to walk, she was helped into the sea by her friends. Aware of what was about to happen to them as they walked to the water's edge, Drummond said to her sisters, "Chins up, girls. I'm proud of you. I love you all." 3 died on the beach before reaching the water, clumped together in death as they had been in life. Irene Drummond was hit with machine gun fire close to the water's edge, killed instantly by the second bullet. Vivian Bullwinkle heard some pray. Others, up to their knees in the blood-stained water, called the names of those they loved. But most fell silently until Vivian was hit by the bullet that would bring darkness, but not death. The Japanese soldiers then bayoneted all the wounded civilians on the beach and in a fisherman's hut. Of the 65 nurses thrown into the sea in the sinking of the SS Brook, 34 suffered brutality, starvation and malnutrition in the women's camp. Vivian Bullwinkle and her closest friends kept her story secret. We remember them today. We remember them every day.
Thank you, Dr. Nelson. The Australian War Memorial was a vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with his troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn their loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed at the entrance to the memorials galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight, we will read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the more than 102,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and other operations for over more than a century. But first, we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths and floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the pool of reflection.
Today, we remember and pay tribute to Sister Lorna Florence Fairweather, who was killed during the Second World War. Lorna Fairweather was born on the 31st of January 1913 at Stirling West, South Australia, to Percival and Florence Johnson of Broadview. She grew up in the suburbs of Adelaide and began her nursing career at Mareeba Babies Hospital in Woodville. Here she excelled, scoring the highest marks in theory and practice, before leaving to complete her training at the Royal Adelaide Hospital. Sister Fairweather had served on the staff at the Crippled Children's Home and risen to the rank of relieving matron at the Royal Adelaide Hospital by the time she enlisted in the Australian Imperial Force on the 11th of October 1940, joining the Australian Army Nursing Service. She was one of the most highly qualified nurses in the service and was called up in July 1941 to commence duty with the 13th Australian General Hospital at Woodside in South Australia. In August, she left Melbourne on board the hospital ship Wanganella, where she worked on the Malay Peninsula, alternating between the 10th and 13th Australian General Hospitals. She was in Singapore with the 13th Australian General Hospital when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. When the fall of Singapore became inevitable, most Australian personnel were evacuated from the island. Official evacuations from Singapore had begun in late January, but continued until the last moment. The nurses of the 13th Australian General Hospital remained until the 12th of February, after Japanese soldiers had landed on the northwest of Singapore Island, and just days before the city fell to the Imperial Japanese Army. Sister Fairweather was among the 65 Australian nurses who left Singapore aboard the Vinabrook. 2 days after their departure, the ship was bombed by Japanese aircraft, and many lives were lost as it sank. Those who could swim made for the nearby Banker Island. Some of the survivors travelled to the nearest port to formally surrender, but Fairweather was among the 22 Australian nurses who remained on the beach to tend the wounded, setting up a shelter with a large Red Cross sign on it. On the morning of the 16th of February, a group of Japanese soldiers arrived and ordered the wounded men capable of walking around the headland, where they were killed. A Japanese officer then ordered the remaining 22 nurses and one civilian woman to walk into the sea. When the water reached their waists, the Japanese opened fire with machine guns. All but one of the women were killed, including Lorna Fairweather. She was 33 years old. Sister Fairweather is commemorated on the Singapore Memorial and on a plaque dedicated in 1947 in the Nurses' Chapel of the Royal Adelaide Hospital. Its inscription reads, "In loving memory of South Australian members of the Australian Army Nursing Service who made the supreme sacrifice, killed by Japanese, World War 1939-1945. Her name is also listed on the Roll of Honour on my left, along with some 40,000 others from the Second World War. Her photograph is displayed today beside the pool of reflection. This is but one of the many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Sister Lorna Florence Fairweather, who gave her life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world. They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
lest we forget.
Lest we forget. We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozières or in the low scrub at Gallipoli, with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes this evening's last post ceremony. We would like to thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial today, and we wish you all a very good evening. Could I, just before we go, ask that the Pro-Land Conference delegates remain in the Western Cloisters in order for your after hours to commence. Thank you.